Welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thank you for joining us on our journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Jan Vermut, and joining me as always are my co-hosts Scott Burleson and Jonathan Edwards. Today, we'll deep dive into the topic of service design with our esteemed guest, Tim MacArthur. Tim is a service designer based in Dublin. His career has seen him work in the enterprise, such as IBM, in consultancy, and in service innovation for various international organizations. He co-founded the Service Design Network, or the Ireland chapter, and he is a visiting lecturer at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. Tim is deeply interested in the intersection of service design and other disciplines in bringing valuable, delightful services to life. So that's certainly a mission I think we can all get behind here on the podcast. So Tim, thank you so much for being here and taking the time.
No, look, likewise, thank you very, very much for having me along. I've enjoyed our discussions up until now, so I'm really looking forward to this.
Perfect, great. So hey, let's dive right in. So I mentioned this a couple of times. I used the word a couple of times of service design. So can you tell me a little bit, how did you get into that? When did it start that you actually got a passion for service design?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I suppose personally, my own journey was really, really circuitous, right? So I didn't come from a kind of a design school background. My undergrad was in Germanic languages and medieval German and Dutch. So it's yeah, nice. not immediately a great match between that and design, but I guess my early career saw me work in London, and I was lucky enough to be involved in some just really, really big change programs, right? So for example, the company that I was involved with was being sold. A consultancy was brought in to kind of re-examine ways of working, how things were done. And yeah, luckily enough, they were looking for people from within the company to help them out, to try and understand the lay of the land and what people were doing. So I kind of got pushed to the front whenever they were asking for volunteers. And being very young at the time, being about 23, just basically went off and took a sheet of paper and a pen and started talking to people about what they were trying to do. Right, so I was given a license to go and talk to internal colleagues. I'd sit with someone in accounts receivable and I'd kind of say what are you trying to achieve? How do you do it today? What works well, what doesn't work well? And I, at the end of the conversation, I kind of asked them where do you pass your stuff on to after, and motion to someone in another cubicle, and I kind of say do you know what they do? And they'd be like, no. So you go over again. And you start the same conversation again. And I guess for me, it was a real, I'd done kind of technical drawing and that sort of stuff. So I was into kind of modeling and creating models as well as the documentation that I was producing. So I guess I just had this kind of this moment where I was kind of sketching stuff up. I was writing things out and I kind of gone, God, I know how it works. You put stuff in over here, it gets move through the system, and this is how the company operates within itself.
So you created a map of how the organization works, basically.
Yeah, there's various flows and different models and different kind of annotations and all that sort of stuff. And I kind of realized I was in a really lucky position. That there wouldn't have been that many people within the company that kind of had that view, and I think it kind of sent me off on a path. That really kind of influenced where I went to after. Worked in kind of software consultancy after that from London as well. And really it was about kind of, I think for me, it began to emerge that I was really just trying to kind of understand needs and come up with come up with ways to articulate those needs, and then help others, to craft things to meet those needs essentially. So, I kind of understood that, there's this kind of field of interaction design. And my work was kind of migrating more towards how things were kind of manifested in digital products. And I was kind of going, okay, well, if I'm working with someone on a custom solution, what are you trying to achieve? Who's going to be using it? What sort of context are they in? And yeah, moved back to Ireland, and I kind of worked again, kind of with those two areas, kind of more process centric stuff, but trying to understand humans within it, and digital product stuff. And ended up working for some financial services places, and they were doing some great stuff, bringing new financial products to market in different countries and trying to understand the culture, what people needed in that context. And slowly all these things started to kind of coalesce and kind of come together, the UX design stuff that I've been doing, the research that I've been doing, the kind of understanding humans in process. I heard sometime along the line, I heard service design for the first time. And did a bit of reading, and I kind of went, oh, okay. So that's that's what I'm doing. So as I said in the intro, a bit of a mixture of context in terms of work. So working in big enterprise stuff, working in consultancy, and working in kind of product houses as well. So service design for me has really kind of been the culmination of a bunch of those things. And kind of gave it a bit of kind of clarity and shape. So
sounds a bit like it's like a mix of chance and talent or something like that, where it kind of led you down this path, and then at one point you found the labels or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I've been lucky. There's been some definite points along the line where my career could have gone in a vastly different direction, but I'm kind of I'm happy with being a service designer. So that's the good thing.
Okay, cool. Can you? I mean, now it's a word, or service design is more and more known, of course, and all of that. But can you still? I mean, what is it? What makes service design different, maybe from other kinds of designs, or what is? Yeah, what is special about it in a sense?
Special, I don't know, but but no, it's a really, really good question. So and there is more kind of clamor being generated around the term service design, and there's more of an understanding of where it might be needed. But very simply, service design is designing services, and if you stop to think about it and think about your everyday life and just the amount of services that you engage with, whether it be whether it be your television, whether it be your your banking service, whether it be traveling someplace, they're all around you, but they're kind of sometimes quite invisible, right? And I guess it's design practice with that intentionality, in the context of service, right? So product is, I think, more easy for people to grasp, because it's something that they can kind of it's something that's there, right? So and the scope can be quite bounded. Even if you're using software that's got kind of service touch points, it's all quite kind of neat and easy to understand. Whereas I think sometimes the invisible aspect of service, the kind of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, the delays, all of this sort of stuff, makes you just kind of not think about it in the same way. It's too complex or too diffuse. So it's really it's really about kind of having that same rigor and that same intentionality that you bring from design practice, but just kind of employing it in the context of service.
Yeah. So it sounds, I mean, you're defining it in a sense of by the specialty of its object, of the thing that you're designing, in a kind of way, if that's fair to say.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's it is that medium, right? So if you're working on digital products, there's certain things that you're dealing with, there's certain constraints, there's certain patterns, there's and it's the same with this, right? It's a different medium that you're trying to design through, and it's got its own characteristics. It's typically multiple actors, typically things that you can and can't see. So there's more complexity, but more opportunity as well. If you're kind of willing to kind of take that step and engage with all the people that you need to engage with, you can really see quite a vast end-to-end case for improvement.
Yeah.
We had a previous guest on, I believe, episode 18 or 19, Murat Gurkar, who is an entrepreneur. And we asked him at some point what the difference between product and service was. And he said, basically, there's no difference. It's exactly the same thing. And I wondered if you could speak to that. What's your opinion on this? Why do we need something specific for service design?
Yeah, I think that's it's a valid question, and it's one that kind of spins off kind of quasi-religious debates sometimes between the nature of stuff.
Yeah.
you know, how value is like, you know, how value is realized, like, you know, how it's like, you know, either, you know, created or co-created, like, you know, whether it's done at a specific point in time or whether it's done over lengths of time. So if you read, like, you know, some of the kind of canonical material, like, you know, service dominant logic, there's, you know, there's axioms and principles that, like, you know, set out, like, you know, how, like, you know, how a service approach to the world is, like, you know, intrinsically different, right? And like, you know, how, like, you know, how the two, like, you know, product and service just have different qualities. I guess, like, you know, to answer your question, like, if you strip things back, sure, I think, like, you know, design practice is design practice, and, like, you know, at a very abstract level, you can say, like, you know, what you're trying to do is, like, you know, is understand needs and reframe that need in some way, like, you know, come up with some way to meet that need that you can kind of, like, you know, perhaps test, and then, like, you know, bring that need into play over time. I think the difference then becomes, like, you know, not quite so much the methods around it and the methodology around it. I think it's the scope, it's the depth, and it's really that, right? So if you're looking at a, you know, a service design initiative, typically it's like, you know, very, very wide. Like, you know, it encompasses, like, you know, the kind of, like, you know, the needs of, like, you know, a number of different actors. Like, you know, some of those are, like, you know, within your control. Some of those are, like, you know, are actors that you have to work with. It considers, like, you know, kind of, like, you know, digital touch points, physical touch points, staff, like, you know, background staff, like, you need to be there to, like, you know, be in place to make the service work. So, you know, at its heart, to answer your question, like, you know, at its heart, probably there is no difference from the design approach to it. But I think the actual medium, and going back to some of the points that we touched on earlier, is different, and, like, you know, it demands just, like, you know, a different set of approaches and a willingness to kind of, like, you know, and, you know, I suppose, like, your own want as a designer to engage with this type of medium, right? So to, like, you know, to kind of want to work with that sort of level of breadth and that sort of level of depth. I think, you know, as designers, we all kind of get our energy from, like, you know, working on slightly different things. Like, you know, I work with, like, you know, really, like, amazing interface designers, and, like, you know, they love sweating the detail about, like, you know, the border radius on a control and what that might mean in the overall scheme of things. Whereas, like, I don't, like, you know, I am interested, but not to the same level. And I think, you know, that's part of it as well. Like, you know, as designers, we kind of are drawn to different things, and we do our best work with different things. I hope that answers your question. I know it was a bit of a long answer, but there is difference, and I think the difference is in the approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Product Quest podcast, we have to bring this discussion up. So we, at one point, maybe not even that consciously, decided to call it the Product Quest podcast. So of course we have to kind of have that debate. But I feel like it's so, maybe just to rephrase what you're saying, is that also, I mean, there seems to be, like you're saying, there in terms of scope, but also in terms of the kinds of challenges that design challenges that you encounter in service design, that they are a bit different than when it comes to product design.
Yeah. But having said that, like, you know, you can use the same, like, you know, the same methods, and I think, like, you know, Jobs to Be Done is a, like, you know, a good example. Like, you know, you had Lance Betancourt on, like, you know, he wrote a great book about, like, you know, service innovation. Like, you know, he put the word in there, and he said, like, you know, here are some different ways in which you would approach, like, you know, different, like, typologies of service that he laid out. Like, you know, and he took the universal job map, and, like, you know, he kind of contextualized it for, like, you know, different sorts of interactions. So, like, you know, even through that, you can see that, like, you know, you take one kind of, like, you know, one kind of core set of, like, you know, ideas and principles, but, like, how that unfolds and how you actually go to use that differs with this kind of medium that you're working through.
Yeah. I mean, it sounded, you started out, when you started out describing even your first kind of assignment where you were pushed to the front, where you kind of you were the involuntary volunteer kind of thing. You start, I mean, you describe, it sounded very much like, so you spoke of, I just talked to the people, I tried to figure out what they want to achieve, I tried to figure out what their needs are and what their problems are, I think you even said. And I think there is a language in there that already hints to something like, I mean, the approach, as you said, the approach is you can use the same approach, be for product, be for service, for me, maybe even for organizational design, so if that's fair to say.
Yeah, I think it is fair to say, and, like, you know, in my own experience as well, like, you know, I've seen Jobs to Be Done, like, you know, used in its different implementations in a number of different contexts. So, you I've seen it used as part of like, sheer like product discovery. So like, how do we like in that sort of frame, understand like, the opportunity, who the customers are, like, understand through research, like, their functional, emotional and social needs. Like, how do we go about prioritizing them? How do we go about grouping them? But like, the thing that you're bringing to bear to like, to meet that is a product. But I've also seen like, kind of like that being a kind of a jobs to be done, an ODI approach. But I've also seen the same sort of core thinking and behind like, jobs to be done, like, person in context, like, different types of needs, been kind of really, really useful to be a starting point for using other like, implementations of jobs to be done, like job stories, right? So approaching a kind of a like, a net new like, platform being kind of like, rolled out, like, how do you actually crucially engage that kind of that like, inject that idea of context, the user's context, like who are the user and what is their context, into kind of writing these bridging stories between like, trying to find out the unknown through to like, kind of like, tangible user stories that can be like, used to like, develop the platform. So I think that's really interesting that like, the same kind of core things can be used like, in different implementations for different purposes.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you maybe, I mean, since we're touching upon jobs to be done, and that's of course something we all care about, at least really the four here. So when did that come into the picture for you, and how does that help you in service design?
Yeah. So like it helps. So there's a couple of pieces to that. Like, so it helps in developing a common language. So, invariably with service design, you're working with a really, really rich panoply of different actors, like, different people who are interested. So what I found is that like, establishing kind of like, jobs language as a lingua franca, and like, and kind of like more, like people can grasp the idea of like, people needing stuff and pulling stuff into their lives in order to kind of meet those needs. And they can grasp the ideas about kind of like, you have things that you are trying to achieve, like, functionally, you've got things that you're trying to achieve emotionally, and socially, right? So I think the rest of the detail around it in terms of like, methodology and approach and all that sort of stuff can kind of stay with the people who are like, practicing it. But I think that kind of simple core of jobs stuff can be used as a kind of a lingua franca across like, a number of different kind of interested parties, stakeholders, people who are actually involved in the design. And I think it's really powerful because it's something that can be grasped easily, it can be understood easily, and it can be remembered. So
yeah.
So like, like I think jobs to be done in that context, really, really useful. And then as an understanding tool, but then also in kind of designing services, like, going back to the point of like, typically you've got, loads of different people that are kind of like, you're trying to create a service for, right? So different actors within it. And again, like, I think it like, helps to kind of like, frame that multiple actor kind of viewpoint on things, that you can say, look, there's a service provider here, there's an internal team here, there's a customer there, like, they show up at different points of these overall journeys, but in the context of that point in the journey, they've got needs that like, should be met. And then if we understand those needs, we can figure out, is that something that we actually want to like, want to kind of make something to, like, is it something that like, we should pursue to like, create an offering for? So it's not easy. It's not easy, right? So like,
in what sense?
Well, just like because it starts to get like, really complex, and like, you're dealing with different people at different speeds. And I think even when you come to that realization of like, there's all these different sets of like, jobs to be done from different people over time. The hard work is then kind of trying to marry all that stuff together and say like, okay, well, there's something that's really important to this set of people over here. There's something that's not so important over here. Like, how do we actually create the kind of like, the common like, red thread that'll kind of go through all of this? And like, it's something that we like, feasibly and can actually like, go ahead and do.
Yeah, no, I know this challenge. Maybe I'll try to rephrase it, but maybe it's not exactly the same that you're describing. But especially when we go into kind of more medtech context, it's not only kind of a medtech thing, but very often there you, at least we or encountered it in that context where you have very different stakeholders. I mean, at the very least, you have something like doctor, patient, nurse, something like that.
Yeah.
That's usually kind of the core three. And then there's a couple of more, of course, always involved there. And at a certain point, of course, you can use jobs to be on there as you said, as a basic logic, understanding how each of these stakeholders kind of what role do they play in the system. But it gets extremely complex, and it's sometimes not even clear how the different jobs relate. I mean, yes, they are in a certain, but it's very hard to, what I can easily do is say, okay, the doctor has the job X, I don't know, to diagnose a patient, for example. And then there is a buying center within the hospital, right? So I can attach job, but how do they actually interrelate? I'm not so sure if even jobs to be honest, as a theory has a good answer to this, or has a kind of an explanation of how they work. Like,
no, like, like, there isn't, right? So, and I think that's like, the context of the problem that you're trying to solve for, like, really dictates a lot of that, and ultimately kind of what the business driver is as well. Like, what are you actually trying to, like, what are you trying to achieve, and how does that bound what we can or we should do, like, versus, like, we've identified some needs, but, like, we don't really have a right to try and address those. Like, those don't, like, those don't belong, like, in the context of the sort of solution that we're offering. So, like, there's no one answer, there's no one set of, like, kind of, like, material or like a toolbox or something like that you can draw down that will give you the answer for this. But I think it's trying to maintain that focus of, what are we trying to achieve as, like, as an endeavor, right? So, and let that be the, like, let that be the kind of guide on this, because it is really, really easy to get spun off into kind of, okay, we're doing all this great research and we're trying to, understand, like, like, all of these kind of sounding like amazing opportunities that, could be addressed, or there's something really interesting that we found out from talking to this doctor. But, you really have to be kind of rigorous and kind of pulling yourself back and kind of going, oh, that's interesting to know, but, like, what we're trying to do right now, it's not perhaps relevant,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, there's this, fascinated researchers are great, but they also sometimes find opportunities that no one cares about. I mean, that's a hard thing to say, but that can really happen, where you get interested in your stuff and you find, but then as a business, what do you do with it? It's all okay, that's all interesting, but as a business, what do you do with it?
Yeah, exactly. And, like, answers are only as good as the questions you ask, so you've got to, like, you've really got to be quite intentional about, like, like, what are we trying to find out? Like, what is the problem? How do we frame it? Like, not only from, like, a customer's perspective, but what are we trying to achieve and what can we do? So it's like, again, not easy, right? I don't have, like, a blanket answer that says, like, this is the approach, this will work. I think, it's down to, like, kind of rigorous self-control and, like, helping to guide others along as well, and to, like, try and keep them on path to,
Yeah. Okay, so for me, I have a couple of kind of like follow-up questions also on service design, in a sense. So you mentioned a couple of times tools and other things that we use, and frameworks and so on. And a lot of what I've seen from service design is, and I think even if there's this book, this is service design, it's in a sense a collection of a lot of different tools. Right. So not just that, but there's a lot of different, a lot of framework. I mean, it's a thick book, many different frameworks. But how do you, what's your stance toward all these different, because there's so many different frameworks, tools floating around there.
No, it's like, this is one of the age-old discussions within the service design community. Like, so, the need for tools versus, like, kind of crossing over into kind of fetishizing the tools themselves, right? And saying, okay, well, we're doing it for, like, for the sake of doing it, or, if I follow this particular recipe of, like, inputs and outputs from, like, from these tools, then, like, I will get the answer. So, tools and the methods to use those tools are important, and they are, and they help to like, guide. They help to kind of basically increase the, like, how easily you can communicate your work, right? So, like, they almost develop kind of like, de facto standards, like, persona is a persona, service blueprint's a service blueprint. You can kind of like, even if you tweak them, you can kind of recognize like, there's a service journey over time. There's like, front stage and backstage. So like from that aspect, they're good, but there is danger, especially when you're starting out, and like, you do encounter all these things in the wild. Like, there's like, loads of toolboxes where you can go in and start to use these things.
Yeah,
like there's a danger that you kind of get sucked in and basically like, spend too much of your time like, using the tool as opposed to trying to understand what you're trying to use the tool for. And and especially with like, maps and models and stuff like that, like, there's some kind of real drawbacks, right? So modeling as like, a group activity is fantastic, right? So it kind of promotes the understanding and awareness of the problem space. Everyone gets to kind of chip in, and like, you create this like, this wonderful artifact. But like you guys know that like, as soon as that thing is done, because of the nature of the tool, it's set at a point in time. It's static, like, and it represents a picture. And even with the best will in the world, like a lot of people just don't go back and revisit those things, right? And it ends up as being, an interesting piece of work that like, represented a point in time, but doesn't actually, maybe doesn't have the utility on an ongoing basis that you'd hope it would do.
Tim, are you saying that you did a project of some sort, you understood the market at some point in time, but it's sort of getting out of date as soon as you start using it? It's not updated. Is that sort of what you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, if you drive a new car off the lot, like, it immediately starts to depreciate in value, right? So it's kind of the same with maps sometimes. Like, once they're done, and once they're like, once they're unfurled, like, stuck up on the wall, end up in Miro, reside in a PDF document someplace. Like, unless there's kind of some intention around it to kind of like say, okay, we will revisit this, it just starts to kind of depreciate in value.
Yeah. I mean, it has to be picked up by the organization. Otherwise, it's. I mean, there is a danger in this. I also think in this more. I mean, okay, there is one way I think where service design and more design techniques have become much more widespread. I think design thinking played a big role in this, and then everybody started to create walls and murals and stuff, which I think is in a sense is helpful and nice, but it has exactly this danger of creating beautiful artifacts in a workshop. But then, what do you do with it? So how do you translate or how do you cope with that challenge of translating findings into action, I guess, or products or services more in the end?
Yeah, that's really the big question, isn't it? So this is all good, but how do you make it actionable? And like, that kind of applies to like a lot of this stuff, right? So like, it applies to research findings, mapping and modeling, like even to kind of like, going back to jobs for a second, like, okay, we've understood all these people's needs, like, now what? How do you actually make that actionable? Part of it is basically like, how do you flip modes then from like, this kind of discovery, like, that might end up in kind of like, mapping and modeling or some other kind of like, findings, and how do you switch modes into actually saying, okay, well, like, this is the direction that we're choosing, like, this is the priority of like, the pieces that we've like, managed to pick from it, using our kind of like, using our approach, like, what's important to us, what's important to the customer. And then how do you actually start to kind of like, flip over to like, delivery of that? So, like, how do you break things down? How do you make them into lists? How do you actually kind of work with others in order to kind of like, kind of plan out how you're actually going to do this? So, it's one thing in software products, like, there's lots of like, accepted kind of ways of working in and around that. But in a service, like, it can be quite difficult, right? So it's with the digital product, you can start to work up like, prototypes fairly handily, like, and you can get them in front of people quite easily. But what do you do with the service? Like, how do you kind of like, start prototyping that so you can start getting like, quick feedback to be able to iterate on. And that's like, that's something that's kind of close to my heart as well, because like, you asked that question, like, you've done all this stuff, like, so what, like, or now what, and it's something that I've been engaged with before. like a couple of different approaches that I've always found being like really useful is to, especially when like talking about services and the kind of like intangible aspects of it, is to start, if you're talking about desired future state, to start doing things like, storyboarding stuff out, like, in like whatever level of fidelity is like, required. But to involve the people, like, that, like, will be kind of like, co-developing and supporting this stuff, and actually like, telling service narratives and saying like, okay, well, look, this is what we found, this is what we've prioritized, this is the direction that we're going to take. Like, let's walk you through a narrative of what that target state might be. And that's really great because like, you can start to like, you can start to basically talk about like, the qualities of these, like, these service touch points and all the like, all the invisible stuff that goes on behind. And you can prompt questions from the group as well. You can kind of go like, if you say like, service works A, B, and C, like, you can prompt the group to kind of go like, why does it go that way? Like, what happens if I do this thing? Like, if I fail here, like, what's the next thing that happens? So, like storyboarding and kind of like telling these narratives, getting people involved is really effective when it comes to prototyping services. And then like you can start to amp that up. So like, one thing that we did in a, like, with a previous employer was to like, kind of smoke test services, and with ever increasing kind of levels of fidelity, right? So as we know more about like, the direction that we're going in, we would be able to like, tell those narratives, but include people from like, the marketing department, or include people from operations, and almost cue them up to like, get them to say their part in it. So like, you'd kind of cast a scenario through it from a customer's perspective and say like, okay, like, I searching my favorite search engine for a term, like, and over to marketing, like, marketing and say, well, like, what we're expecting to go is like, given our approach, we should show up, this is the sort of language that we show up in. And then you can say, okay, from a customer's perspective, I click on the thing, like, what happens next? Like, you get in contact with somebody, so over to contact center, like, and you can basically start to kind of choreograph and like, orchestrate these things and get, not only internal stakeholders, the people who are kind of like, supporting this, but like, like you can also get customers in as well to see this thing kind of like, take shape and get their feedback. Like, is this something that would be desirable? Like, can you see any problems with this? So,
yeah.
Hopefully that answers your question. It was really about kind of like, moving from kind of covered static stuff into something that's more kind of dynamic.
No, absolutely. Go on.
I've still been chewing on, just listening, still chewing on this distinction between product and service, and what occurs to me. I'm just wondering if you'd see it the same way. It seems the distinction is that a service, that people are the solution, or at least a high percentage of the solution. Like, people are doing things as opposed to an object doing things. Is how would you respond to that thought?
That's a really nice way of putting it. Like, frankly, right? So like, again, going back to some of the, like, the literature in and around this, like service dominant logic, they'll say that, like, essentially, like, products are kind of avatars for, like, services, or like, kind of reflect the kind of accumulated knowledge and all that sort of stuff. But I actually like what you say, that it is kind of moving beyond, like, an individual touch point, like, a digital or a physical thing, and it is including more of that kind of, like, human element. So, how are people actually, like, prepared to deliver that service? Like, do they have like, do they have supporting things like, scripts? If you're like, if you're a call center operator, do you have, like, instruction manuals? Do you have guidelines? Like, is there a company policy and, like, the sort of language that we should use in like, in working with customers and doing stuff for them? So yeah, like, I like what you say, like, it is moving beyond, like, that type of touch point, and, like, including more of that kind of human elements, the kind of messy, complex human elements.
Well, I was thinking about it when you were talking about prototyping, and it occurred to me, like, when you build a physical prototype of something, you can run people through the experiment. Here's my new product. Let's have people, various demographics. We can run them through it, and we have them try to accomplish do whatever we want to. But then you were talking about prototyping a service. So to prototype that, we would need to run people through your prototype. But then we've got the variability of the people that
Yeah,
are
yeah.
your prototype seems like it's going to be more like if we build something physical, I mean, we can ensure everybody gets this same thing. It's going to look the same. I mean, to the degree that we can, but when prototyping your service, it seems like that would be a real challenge in getting this. Well, first of all, getting this consistent experience as they're testing it. And then once you say, hey, that prototype, we want to expand it. Well, now you have these individual people as part of your prototype. Now scaling that to where lots of people, that it seems like that would be a huge, if we're thinking about differences in product and service, that seems like that would be a huge challenge with scaling up. What are your, I'm just making observations. What do you think?
No, I think it's a really fair one, right? So if you look at services and like they're stochastic systems, right? They contain variability, right? The things that are going through them are messy humans.
Yeah, right.
You know, a lot of the stuff that provides the service are messy humans, and it happens over time. There's many different ways in which you can kind of enter, continue, exit. So it presents more challenges, right? So as you say, with a thing, right? You can instrument it, and you can say, okay, how many people interacted with this particular page? How many people hit that button? So I think again, it just takes a little bit more rigor in advance to kind of say generally what are the sort of success conditions for what we're trying to put out there. And it's and it's not easy, right? Because a lot of those things are intrinsically quite qualitative, right? So it's yes, you can instrument certain things along the way and gather quantitative data, you can bring it back and analyze it, but because all those messy humans that we talked about, a lot of that stuff is inherently qualitative. So you've got to spend more time on kind of sifting through and parsing that stuff out to say is this thing doing the thing that that we should do? And unfortunately, a lot of the times they don't, right? So I think we can all we can all remember a particularly bad service encounter.
It's usually those that we remember.
Yeah, well, there you go.
That's true. That's true.
And if you look at I think governments, we mentioned healthcare obviously presents that type of massively complex set of experiences that you're trying to design for. But if you look at governments, I think it's an amazing opportunity to try and apply that same intentionality over time. It's not easy though.
Yeah, so I have the same. I also remained on that question of products and services, and it may sound like one of those philosophical questions that people debate for hours, but actually
in their free time.
I mean, I think that it is a gateway to actually something quite important, in my opinion, because let me just ask a question. If we algorithmize, I hope that's a word, a service, would it still be a service? So does it make sense to talk about services when you, for instance, you're talking about a call center operator and say they have a script? I mean, can we still qualify that as a service? And does it make, my question, I think I would like to go a bit beyond that. And is it a good strategy to algorithmize a service? Does it actually make sense? And is this a good approach?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think using that example, I suppose what you can do is you can provide guidelines. I don't think you'll ever be able to unless you replace a person with a kind of a fairly limited technology alternative, whether it be some sort of chatbot or something that
we do have software as a service, for instance. I mean, that's a thing.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess if I understand your question, if you go too far down that road of prescribing what should happen in a service encounter, does it then just become kind of something that's almost productized or monetized?
Yeah. I mean, would you lose the uniqueness and benefits you get from what one would call a service? Because I think there is kind of a difference between a service and a product, and we're trying to get at it. And if there's a difference, obviously both of them might be more or less useful in different circumstances and have their benefits and drawbacks.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You just reminded me of something when you're speaking into the benefits that people can bring that's hard to be programmed in with an algorithm. And the example that came to mind, I remember I was at Disney World with my kids when they were little, and they were 3 and 1, and the 3-year-old, it was by some bad planning. We were there on New Year's Day, and it happens to be the busiest day of the world, the busiest day of the year at Disney World. I had no idea. And so it was just a total disaster. And the 3-year-old is screaming, crying, just crying. And a Disney employee noticed this and came over and gave us like some free passes to like jump in line. And it really salvaged the day. It completely salvaged the day by that. It's hard to imagine that being replaced by an algorithm, by AI, by somebody that recognizes the a screaming child, and in that case, the service. And you can imagine. And look, that's a long time ago, and that's a very vivid memory of how that human element. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jonathan, but I was you just.
No, I think that goes exactly. It goes exactly in the direction I was trying to get to, which is, this is exactly what I had on my mind too. I think when you're talking about a service, and you mentioned this, Scott, that a great part of it is delivered by humans. Humans are thinking beings. They are complex adaptive systems, we might say, and this obviously has its benefits and drawbacks. Going back to what I was saying previously, and so the question is it worthwhile to eliminate that from when you're designing a service? Is it worthwhile to productize the service by making it more algorithmic, and in which situations is it beneficial to do that or not?
I'm gonna give you a consultant's answer on that, which is it depends, right? So like it depends on what you're trying to achieve, and if there is if there's reasons for kind of replacing a human staffed contact center with with a chatbot, for example, is it a set of tasks that can be accommodated by that? Is it something that we want to pursue because it makes financial sense? Can we make the trade-offs versus people's perception of quality versus the other benefits that we're trying to I don't think you'd never be able to as a blanket kind of just say okay, well we're just gonna automate all of this. I think you can examine the pieces of an overall service scape, and if you're so minded, try and swap bits of that in and out, but that's based on a whole bunch of perceived trade-offs versus benefits for both yourself and your customer versus kind of drawbacks for each as well. I am interested in this area, what constitutes value, how is value realized, who's involved in co-creating value, and a lot of I was lucky enough to work in a company before that was making the kind of transition to becoming a lean enterprise, right? So along with that came ways of working. So Kanban as being the approach across the enterprise to try and understand the flow of value, streams of value, make work visible, try and kind of be optimal in terms of how value is perceived and how it's pursued over time. And I think for me as a service designer, that was quite useful because I think it's kind of going to some of the points that you were mentioning earlier on, what type of countermeasure do you bring in right at a certain point in time within a service? Is it something that optimizes the hell out of something because that will give the best benefit, or is it something that's more as you say, you're waiting in a queue, your kid's crying, a bot or something will not be able to say move on, take these passes, have a good day, so there's always going to be a mixture, and that mixture should be made on trade-offs. Right? So what are you trying to achieve overall as part of the endeavor, and how will that land with your customers?
But I think maybe I'm but I think stuff like these experiences, I think these can be designed, they might feel, as you from a customer perspective, they might feel like, oh, they went out of their way to do blah blah blah. So picking up that their child is crying and then really helping you or whatever. So but you this can be intentionally designed as well. So I mean, I remember this quite well in another project we had. It was in retail, so do it yourself store. And then there's always the question of how do the people that walk around and restock the stuff in the store, how do they interact with their customers? And for a very long time they didn't design this interaction, and they didn't design this interaction. Yeah. So what you get is pissed customers and pissed employees, basically, because for them the experience was the customer is asking me a question and they disturb me in doing my job of refilling things, and the customer is annoyed because the guy doesn't give me a nice answer, he doesn't help me, blah blah. And then they started intentionally designing how do we respond to a customer, and different people responded. So I think there is maybe some kind of a middle ground here where you can even. So I don't think the niceties are something that are happen by chance. You can, if you really want, as a company, design them.
No, it's a really interesting point, right? So and people sometimes get their backs up about experience design, right? So people go like, you can't design an experience, you design the circumstances for an experience. So you kind of scaffold up an environment where good things can happen if you plan for it accordingly. Like go back to the kind of like the stochastic system and containing variability. What you can do is kind of create kind of guidelines or policy, right? So the policy for for that person, if they're interrupted by a tap on the shoulder, whether they're trying to stock the shelf, the company might say, look, what we're trying to do is be perceived as a kind of a friendly, helpful company. Please engage with them in this way. Kind of put down what you're doing. Walk down the aisles. Motion in a friendly way to where they need to go, and that's what we expect of you. So that's our piece of our policy that should be employed in that. But of course, because we're human, some days you get the tap on the shoulder and you're just not in the mood, so you mightn't you mightn't perform that service in the way that was expected. So
yeah. No, absolutely. I agree. I mean, I think things can always go wrong, right? So, anyway. But is it so? But is it for you service design in this sense? Is it designing that interaction, or is that something more or else? I mean, there is because you mentioned experience design. Maybe that's even something different. I'm now trying to figure out where are the boundaries of service design in a certain sense.
It starts to get pretty messy.
Maybe if
you ask 3 service designers for a definition of service design, you'll end up with 7 definitions. Because everyone's kind of doing it in slightly different contexts. They might be doing it more in if you look at what people working in government, for example, service design in government, the sort of problems that they're dealing with are vastly different to someone who's kind of thinking about the service in and around a software product, for example. The problem space and the bounds of it are vastly different. So sometimes you just don't get the opportunity to go down into the depths of understanding what a piece of policy might be in terms of of that guy working in the shop. But I know I've worked with designers on offerings and where you'd work with interaction designers, content designers, visual and packaging designers to work with them, as well as the extended team, to say, look, this is the overall direction that we're going. It's qualities of this are X, Y, and Z. Everything should kind of be marshaled and work together in that way. So you can work with designers who are more concerned with individual touch points and so on. As a service designer, you may not go there yourself, but you'd have a kind of a view of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, go on, John.
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems to me the tools you use will again, analytical tools, customer journey maps, service blueprinting. These will, in a way, be algorithmic. They will describe a process, and I think the service blueprinting will try and describe okay, when the customer does this is what happens in the background, and which teams do what, etc. My question is, how do you get to this kind of heuristic, let's say, or this we gave a few examples, the employees in the shop, that where does this appear in the service blueprinting somehow? That's kind of my question, is what kind of tools can we use to describe these? I don't know. I don't have a better word than heuristic of okay, when this happens, this is kind of the way you should act. Does this appear in service blueprint? Yeah.
Like it can do. Like, typically, like, if you're either, like, designing or, like, documenting an as is, or, like, designing a target state, like, a service blueprint, for example, as you bring it up, will kind of, like, describe that journey, have a start point and end point, steps within it, and, like, start to kind of stub out the, like, the front stage interactions and the backstage interactions. So it's up to the designer and the scope of the problem that they have, the various actors within it, to be able to kind of, like, call that out and say, like, okay, well, look, we've done observations of, like, of how this works. We know where the company wants to go in terms of, like, it wants to present a friendly face. We think that there's a specific moment in here, like, so journey might be called, like, confused customer, like, request help, right? So, one of those journeys might be, like, confused customer on shop floor, like, request help from busy member of staff or from member of staff. And if you think about, like, in that context, like, then you can kind of craft those kind of, like, kind of checklists or, heuristics, like, best rules of thumb to, like, to kind of apply in that particular context.
Rules of thumb, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Really like. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
Well, what I really liked, you touched on it before, and I think maybe it kind of it went under. It should be more pronounced. You mentioned narratives and storyboards, and I'm here getting out of my field of experience. So I don't. These are usually things that people do with the results I bring, but I'm not an expert in this, right? So, but I feel like there is something in creating narratives and creating storyboards that can kind of give this rule of thumb. So I once had we had a project. It was in financial services as well, a project in financial services, and because we always struggle with, we bring results and then sometimes very little happens, and add the noises. And then on the other side, we had a client who was really engaged. So, and what they did, they took our results that we brought. It was a jobs done project and so on. And what he then created with his team was storyboards of how the pain points we found, the customer problems we found, should be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it was really, a storyboard. So it was a story, you could see it. There were people involved, and I loved this. I really liked it. It completely transformed, and behind it was statistical data, and we did a survey and all that kind of stuff. But what he presented in the end to the organization were 5 stories, I think, like 5 really stories of how, and that's so easy then to go to another department and say, it should look like this, it should feel like this. So I feel like narratives there's a power to narratives, I think, that maybe gets underappreciated sometimes.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, so, and I think whenever you bring the various different people that, like, are should be an actor in that narrative, like, you bring them together, they're either going to kind of perform something, or, like, and you basically explain to them in the course of this narrative, this is where we think we're going with this. It's just, it's quite a cheap way to to prototype something, and you can gather that feedback. Like, going to the example of, confused customer on shop floor, if you created a small kind of, like, storyboard or a vignette of what would happen, you say, okay, well, like, going off our research, we think our desired behavior is, a member of staff directs person over to a small map. People can immediately go back, like, and give feedback and say, no, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to, provide a kind of a tailored service. So you can kind of gather that feedback before, like, anything is designed for, essentially.
So what I'm wondering now is, what is really the difference between a storyboard and a customer journey map? And it's also out of my field of expertise, but I would venture to say that a journey map is a higher generalization and of a journey, and a storyboard is a specific. Is that good, or?
I think they can be bounded by the same thing. I think you could have like a start, middle, and end that could be represented both as a storyboard, but also as a journey map. Like it could contain the same sort of steps and that sort of thing, so they could have the same bounds. But I think what you're trying to do with the journey map is to like tell a more kind of granular, essentially behind the scenes, data rich story, right? So you can add kind of like swim lanes to a typical journey map to kind of call out these moments. Like maybe going back to your example from earlier, kind of the storyboard will tell one of the eventualities, so this is how we think that we should react in the future. But the journey map could contain all of the eventualities, what could happen. So I think they're different tools for different purposes. I think journey maps essentially, journey maps, service blueprints, contain that extra depth and richness of information, and they're able to kind of basically represent it in a way that it would just be really unwieldy to try and kind of force into a narrative, right? So if you're telling a story and suddenly you're talking about all the backstage operations and data needs to move from here to here and all the rest of it, it kind of take you away from the actual the experience of the customer, kind of going through that journey, right? So I think they're different tools for different purposes, scoped the same way, but really complementary as well.
Yeah. I think it's really about what you said this much nicer than I can repeat it now. But it's not about it. I mean, different tools. It's not about the tool. It's about what you want to achieve with the tool or something like that. You say. So,
exactly.
As long as you're on,
Like if you've got a good idea about the outcomes that you're trying to reach, and for him, it's everything. It's picking the thing that'll kind of get you there in the most effective way.
Yeah. So I want to jump a little bit, just a tiny little bit in terms of topics, because I'm sure there is people out there that we mentioned all these beautiful things, service blueprint and service design and all these different tools and kind of things, but there still are companies where this is not yet an established way of working, where this is not maybe not even appreciated or not even on the radar. So is there kind of how can you, if you are somebody who thinks in a service design way or would like to be a service designer in a company that is not yet there, what can you do? How can you bring organizations to that point to start working more in these ways?
Like at a really basic level, it's I know it sounds like overly simplistic, but start doing it, right? So kind of journey mapping, an experience, that kind of tells the story in or around a digital experience, having that extra context around it. Start kind of seeing what methods help you, right, and help others, right? So if you tell this richer story, or if you use a persona, or if you start to use these methods and other people start to perceive value for it, it aids the development of something, or it gives extra context to somebody else, or it brings home the idea of value to somebody else. I think you can start introducing these things, and if it suits your context, the context that you're working at, there's no hard and fast rule that says you must be a service designer in order to do a service blueprint. There's absolutely not, right? So I think you can start doing these things if it's valuable, right? And if it's valuable to others, if there's utility in doing the thing. And the good thing, if people are interested, if any of your listenership are interested in service design, and I'd be glad to kind of put together a kind of a reading list of some of the some of the good books out there, and some websites to hit up as well, just to kind of going back to the tools.
How do you say this in English? I mean, you're pointing to a wound of mine. I think so whenever we do a podcast like this, we usually end up with a reading list afterwards that we should catch up on. And I think it was a couple of months or a couple of episodes ago where we said, okay, now we're gonna start putting that reading list on the website and just show all the people that we talk to, what are the books that they And of course, we haven't done it yet. But
Yeah.
but
We need some service innovation.
we see.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to add to your burden, but like I'm happy to put something together. I'll keep it light.
No, sure, but
I
where would
had
you
that
point?
as a question? Yeah. So
Where would you point people to? Where to start?
Well, like there's a bunch of the books, like so some of the books that you talked to earlier, like so like some of the most recognized ones are like this is service design thinking, this is service design doing. There's like orchestrating experiences. There's some neat kind of like teaching books out there as well. So Lara Pennon came out with Designing the Invisible a couple of years back, which is the first kind of pedagogy for actually kind of teaching service design in an educational kind of format. So like there's like just looking around me here, there's a lot.
What's
right?
laying around? Like
yeah. I think this the like and so some of them range from like the very kind of like sheer theory, which is good, and like and I suppose going back to some of our conversation around kind of like the nature of product versus service. Like for folks who are interested, like there's some really good books out there that kind of like investigate that topic. But then it goes right down to the kind of like sheerly kind of like functional stuff as well, which is like here are some methods, here like here's how you go about using these tools. So I'll like I said, like if it's useful, I'll throw a book list at you, and as well as some links.
that would be really nice. I mean, you sent me a couple of texts already. I think that would be really nice, and then we attach it to the description of the podcast.
Yeah.
Hopefully by the time this podcast goes out, check out the description. There will be a list of great books and reading material. Sorry, Scott. I think I cut you up for it.
No, I was just going to say the same thing. This is our way of holding ourselves accountable. We're going to make the statement. It will be on the website. ProductQuestPodcast.com. We will get them out there. This is our catalyst for
now. We kind of have to. Okay. Anyway, it's a good thing. Okay, good. So, but maybe so. Okay, I think it's what I really like is where you said, okay, just start doing it. I mean, I think it's the same thing with other things. A couple of times we touched upon the question of jobs to be done. With the same, just start doing it. You don't even have to use the name. I mean, forget about the name. No, probably many people in your organization won't care about the name as much as you do. So just use the tool like it. So
that is true.
But and forget your fascination with the tool and whatever, and then just do it. And if it works and if it's helpful, that seems to be kind of your message. That
no, absolutely. Like start small, inspect, adapt, and as well as reading the books and kind of like reading yourself into the topic. Yeah. What I would say as well is, and this is this is no self-reflection, but the service design community are just a really, really nice bunch of people, right? So
I was gonna go there, yeah.
Between meetups, whether it be through the service design network or other stuff, seek out these meetups, right? So you'll get some really, really interesting topics. They're all over the place.
Can you talk a little bit about the service design network, what it is? And you founded the Ireland chapter. Is that right?
Yeah. Co-founded the Irish chapter and led it for about 5 years from its inception. So yeah, look, like what it is it's a chapter of kind of an international non-profit organization that's there to kind of raise the awareness and practice in and around service design. What we did as part of that, what we do as part of that are the meetups that we just talked about there. So get some interesting people to come along and talk about the stuff that they're doing, so other people can kind of think about it and ask questions and see how they can apply that same stuff to their own context. But we've also done things like with the Service Design Network's kind of global conference here in 2018 in Dublin, which is great, because it starts to like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So the more that we kind of engage in this conversation, the more kind of companies and public bodies that come along and say, actually that's something that we think would work for us. The more it kind of increases the community of practice, new stuff starts to emerge. There's there's energy around it. So I think for me that was the main thing, right? So I was in an effort to try and kind of bring folks together that like, could be practitioners already or interested in kind of trying out the sort of things that we're just talking about there, like, trying out new methods and tools, giving them tangible examples that they could kind of like, think about, and just kind of also being able to kind of have conversations with government. And we kind of like, we had a input into like, a kind of a government paper on future skills, for example, and through having that kind of it starts to kind of give you I suppose the license to like, to be able to kind of like, speak as like, a representative body, that sort of stuff. So plenty of good points to it, but the community is kind of the core aspect.
Yeah.
And just to drive the point in, what would be the tools you would recommend people look at first, so they can actually start practicing? As we mentioned before, every time I've looked into service design, I found it to be an extremely broad topic. So what would be the concrete things that you think would be most worthwhile for people to start using?
Yeah, no, good, really, really good question, right? So, and I think like an answer to that, especially because typically what you're trying to do with service design is to kind of take that dive into the invisible and intangible aspects of a service. And how do you go about doing that most effectively? Like, if you try and map and model these things, right? So I guess that's where I'd recommend kind of like, getting to grips with like, service design first, right? So whether it be journey mapping, I know a lot of people journey map, right? So it's not just something that's like, that's within the bounds of service design. But I think if you're thinking about it in a kind of an end-to-end service aspect, like, you can take that kind of capability and start to like, break it out and extend it. Like, different types of maps and models, like service blueprinting. And like for me, like, that's a kind of a continuing learning journey as well, right? So like, like I like mapping and modeling. Like when I was learning about lean, like, I kind of get into value stream mapping, and it's kind of a different kind of take on like, experience and a different sort of level of granularity of detail. But like what I found so like, for someone that's starting out mapping and modeling, to like, just research and try out stuff that works for them. But I guess for me, it's like it's a never-ending journey either, like as well, because like, I've like, in the last couple of years started to try and kind of engage more with systems thinking, and once you start to recognize like, the kind of limits of like, of kind of journey mapping, blueprinting, that sort of stuff, like, they're not dynamic. Like, they represent a point in time. They are like, constrained to like, a certain level. Like, how do you then start to kind of like, move beyond that to solve like, a different nature of problem? So, I like, in my kind of designer conceit, I guess I was kind of going, yeah, like, ecosystem modeling, it's easy, it's fine. You take a bunch of circles, you draw some relationships, and it's good. But like, I started to like, realize that wasn't cutting it, frankly. Like, I got very into like, kind of like, systems approaches, right? So whether it be kind of understanding a system and like, mapping out causality and relationships and polarity, and like, trying to really think about variables and like, bounded systems, and then into like, into kind of stocks and flows, and trying to understand, like, again, like, if you start off with this really big picture, and like, you bound your system, you understand the kind of like, the stocks and the flows and the variables at play and the relationships and kind of how it can all interplay. I think that really forms a nice frame for some of the kind of lower level kind of mapping endeavors, right? So if you say, okay, well, we believe that there's a specific point within this ecosystem that, like, if we came up with an intervention or some sort of countermeasure, that we could really kind of influence the rest of this, and like, you can actually kind of like, kind of scenario plan for that sort of stuff using your ecosystem models. Then the neat thing is you can actually start to think about like, your service blueprint or your journey or whatever, like, and start to kind of design that set of interactions that can kind of speak to that, like, that kind of crucial point within the like, the overall ecosystem, basically. So I think they all kind of complement each other like, really well. And once you're on that kind of like, that kind of pathway down mapping and modeling, it doesn't really end, So there's always.
So I think it's fantastic you actually talked about system thinking, because that's exactly what my next question was going to be, because I have noticed a lot of service designers are into systems thinking, and you mentioned the stocks and flow, so Donella Meadows' work and her books, and I mean many others, and so systems dynamics, I would guess, and I was actually curious, why do you think, maybe the answer is obvious, but why are so many service designers into systems thinking and product designers I've found less so?
Well, tough question. I'm probably going to be hauled over the coals no matter what I say in answer to that one. So, I don't know, right? So if you look at service designers, they come from they've all got like vastly different kind of sets of interests, but like the commonality seems to be the way in which you kind of approach modeling or understanding these things, right? That's something that we can agree on, right? So you could be working in something to do with ecology or climate change, and naturally then you start to kind of move beyond an individual kind of touch point experience to something that could be more of a service, and then into something where you're trying to understand a kind of a more complex ecosystem again. If you're involved in government, again, right? So you can start to kind of design the kind of the micro and the meso kind of style interactions, but at some point in time, you will start thinking about the kind of broader ecosystem of what all this stuff is happening in. And I think from my own experience and in stuff like healthcare, for example, that's where it's been really, really useful. So again, you're kind of starting off with maybe a digital application for a patient to help them do something, and this takes place within a broader service scape, where stuff happens, right? And there's touch points with humans and all this sort of stuff. But that in turn, happens within this much wider ecosystem of like stocks of patients moving from one kind of state to another, not ill to getting better. You can start to kind of chart out the flows between them, and how the things that you're doing actually start to kind of influence that, right? So can we try something? And if we try something, if we introduce a new digital touch point or a new service, can we see then later, at that higher level, that is some variable within the system that increases awareness of a particular disease, for example. So if we create more awareness, does that affect the overall flow, and therefore the stocks of patients moving from state A to state B? So I know that's a very long-winded and wordy wordy answer, but I think service designers working in different areas will start to naturally kind of go, okay, I really like the things I'm doing, I understand it, I get it, but it's happening in in a broader thing, right? What is that thing, and how do I go about understanding it? So whereas sometimes with, that's going back to what I was saying earlier on about where you get your energy from, I know people are fantastic user interface designers, they are excellent. Couldn't give a damn about an ecosystem, or and if I started talking to them about that sort of stuff, they'd kind of move away. so I think it's just a natural progression of people's interests, really.
Yeah. But I think I mean, this is for me something complete. I knew that this would make Jonathan smile. So that, because I knew that you were into system thinking, and that's kind of where he's coming from. But so that's, for me, it's rather new. So, but the image that I got is that correct? That you're trying, I mean, really to tackle the problems at a system level, or are you just kind of being aware of the influences? Kind of, yes, I'm in a bigger context of a certain system like healthcare, or is it really this? So I'm still struggling to understand. Or are you trying to redesign the system? But then you kind of, so yeah, maybe is that enough as a question? I don't know.
No. That's totally a fair question. Sorry, I think connection dropped for a second. I think totally valid point, right? And not everything. You can't design everything, right? In the context of who we are and what we're doing in our particular company, or the endeavor that we're in. You literally can't design what someone else is doing mostly, right? So what you can do is look for points of leverage within that, right? So if you understand that broader system, and going back to that example of someone becoming aware of some symptoms that they're having. Right? So if you can affect that awareness, right, and you're not going to affect all the other stuff, like, you're not going to make them kind of, give up the bad habit that's causing the thing, like, and that's maybe not within your wheelhouse. But like, what you can do is kind of like, increase awareness of like, of something about themselves, right? And if you do kind of pump up that variable, that presents the opportunity for like a targeted solution to say like, okay, well, let's do something there, right? And it'll be that one point within the overall ecosystem that you can kind of like handle, hard tackle, and you can really do something about. Just can't do something about everything because, well, you can't.
So. Yeah. But I really like this because I think it's a different set of goals. I mean, on the one hand is kind of influencing the system is maybe not even that directly beneficial to the company, but maybe kind of in a couple of indirect ways. So I really liked it. It's taking a very different. I mean, okay. So why am I thinking it? Because for me, jobs to be done is one way of getting people making one step out of the company. Right. And looking at your company from the outside, not just from within, but really from the perspective of the people that are using your product and your service. And it seems like the systems thing is like 10 steps more and almost taking a society perspective or something like that. Or am I overloading?
No, like I think like half the battle is determining the bounds of your system, because you can keep on spinning off forever and kind of like, okay, well, this thing's connected to that thing, and so you've got to be kind of really intentional about saying like, this is our scope of focus, right? And this is like, this is the things that are important to us. And it's funny you should mention jobs to be done, right? So how about this, right? So if people like, have needs, right? And if needs are driven by context, right? So the circumstances that they find themselves in, and they've got functional, emotional, and social needs, and like, depending on their context, they kind of like, reprioritize themselves, right? Or like, change, like, are kind of different. Yeah. I wonder, like, if we could like, map an ecosystem, right? And if we could see the variables at play, and if we could like understand people in the situation as in the map, right? And saying, okay, well, if we've got this variable, this level of awareness here, like, means that this population over here has a certain set of needs, right? So, but what if we change that variable with some sort of countermeasure, be it a product or service or whatever, and we change that variable and that had a relationship effect to this population? Like, could we then say, okay, well, that changes their jobs to be done, right? So they're less worried about like, their symptoms, for example. It's a stupid example, but like, if we increase awareness, they're more aware of their symptoms. Does that change their jobs to be done? And is there something in there that's like, important for us? And can we address their new state with a different value proposition, right? And provide that continuity. So I know that's like a way out there, but I'm just kind of wondering, is there like, I'd like to be able to like, understand or think a little bit more about like, how these different ways can be kind of like, brought together. Like, so you brought up jobs to be done. I wonder, is there some way that like, is like, of utility basically that would like, that would be able to bring the two things together?
Well, I think maybe something that's relevant here is the work, and we were discussing this before we started recording, of Knevin and Dave Snowden, who distinguishes 4 different problem situations or situations. So you have the simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic regions. And so you would tackle each of these situations with a different approach. And intuitively, I don't know if this is correct, but I would imagine jobs to be done works really well in, let's say, simple and complicated situations, but much less so in complex situations. And when you're talking about services, as you're dealing with humans who are complex, you naturally often get to that area of the problem space, and therefore you need to maybe use different approaches, such as mapping out systems and things such as this. So a system, essentially it's a set of entities with relationships, and I think as soon as and the problem is, of course, if you start acting on one aspect of the system, it'll affect another aspect of the system. And And I think so. If you would imagine jobs to be done where you're solving one job, but this actually affects some other job maybe you're trying to get done, and then you start getting all these interrelationships between jobs where solving this job actually makes you not solve this job, for instance. Then maybe in those cases it might be useful to take a kind of a systems approach.
Yeah, where you're trying to, like, you know, solve the right job, right? So, and, like, you know, avoid unintended circumstances, right? So, like, you know, solving this thing, like solving for this job over here, like, actually means like, you know, that over here you're like, you know, you're creating a, like, you know, a new set of issues. So
yeah, and I mean, for there's also this notion of you know, I mean, dissolving problems somehow in systems thinking, where you for instance, in healthcare, you may have a lot of people who come in with diabetes, so you can make a journey map and you can think about the jobs to be done of someone with diabetes and how you're going to, you know, handle that. But maybe if you look at it more broadly, you could say, okay, maybe how can we stop people from getting diabetes in the first place? And so in that case, you have to start doing all of this. And another, I think, interesting thing that, for example, so system dynamics is in the systems thinking arena brings to the table is this, which what you mentioned was previously, is this notion of the time dependence. So this notion of delays and how things can affect also the system in that way. And there we go into the more of the design side of things, in the solution side, I guess. But
yeah, like
that's definitely interesting.
I think, yeah, you're bang on. Like that notion of delay is largely missing from, like, you know, other kind of ways of modeling stuff. Like, you know, so, like, you know, do something, some time passes, like, you know, like, what happens, like, you know, what sort of time is passing, like, you know, what is, like, you know, the effect of that. But it's interesting you should kind of mention the kind of, like, you know, dissolving issue or dissolving problems as well. I think, like, I haven't spent some time in lean land as well. Like, there's, like, you know, some interesting tools that can be brought into, like, you know, kind of the way in which we kind of design stuff in any way, like, you know, so, you know, things like failure mode and effect analysis that try and kind of, like, you know, like, force you to think about stuff in advance of, like, you know, what can go wrong, like, you know, and what way do you approach that, right? So different thing, right? So, like, you know, kind of lean is very linear, like, you know, it's about, like, you know, it's about tracing value streams, like, you know, systems thinking, like, you know, much more dynamic. But that idea of dissolving and kind of, like, almost de-risking and preparing for stuff, like, you know, it's not only in kind of intangible things that you could plan for using kind of failure mode and effect analysis, but also in, like, it's one of the kind of core things within their, like, you know, physical products as well. So, you know, this idea, if you've ever looked at one of those old SIM cards that used to go into that you'd see going into mobile phones, like, you know, they'll have that, like, you know, kind of corner taken off it, so you'd know exactly, like, you know, where to put it in. This idea of, like, you know, poka-yoke, that you'd make something foolproof. I think that, like, it's interesting that you've got all these kind of different approaches to kind of, like, you know, dissolving a problem in advance, right? So you kind of remove the circumstances whereby an issue can happen.
So we're somewhere in the middle, or somewhere deep in the middle of service design, systems design, and all of that. I love it. So I love it. This is something really new for me. And it sounds extremely interesting. I want to go a tad back to service design and maybe just ask you kind of, where do you think is service design as a, how would you call this, as a thing, as something in companies, but also as a kind of a discipline on its own? Where do you think is it going? What are some of the big trends and or focus points at the moment?
I'd like to see it become just as normal, like, you know, as context deems appropriate, as, like, you know, other types of design. I think it augments, and I think it complements, like, you know, other ways of doing things. Like myself, I've worked along, like, you know, teams of, like, you know, UX designers, interaction designers, you know, UI designers, researchers, content people, and I think, you know, normalizing that and saying, well, okay, we all have something to bring to this overall picture, I think, like, you know, would be like, I think we'd all end up those bad service encounters that we can all think of off the top of our head, like, you know, at least be good for one or two of those, right? So so, like, I'd like to, and I see it in Ireland at the moment, that there's more jobs being posted for service designers, right? So not kind of something service design, something, like, you know, hidden in the middle of a kind of a, a UX designer spec, like, people are actually kind of recognizing it, and there's a pull for it. So I think that's I think that's really positive. And I think like, a more intentional approach to how we go about pulling services into our lives, I think would benefit all of us. I am biased naturally, but
aren't we all?
Yeah. But like, I guess, what else is happening? Like, and trends in service design in general. I think, what I wanted to say, like, trade or anything like that, like, we're being presented with some really big challenges in terms of, like, of what do we do about, like, impending changes to climate? Like, how can we kind of put stuff out there that helps people to, like, start dealing with it, invariably the problems that they're going to start dealing with. Like, can service design, like, help, like, in that regard? And I think, like, there's a lot of good work being done by different agencies and stuff like that at the moment to talk about kind of, like, the new realities that we're entering into. And, like, there's some big problems like that, like, population, like, moving, that type of thing, right? So how do we actually kind of, like, prepare? How do we kind of, like, have, wraparound services for people who are kind of, like, entering precarious states, so, yeah, like, so there's, like, kind of normalizing service design as a practice, like, bringing it into just the way that we do things. But there's also, like, kind of, again, splicing it with other approaches to, like, taking on some of the bigger issues as well, and, like, helping to kind of, collaborate and co-create ways in which to kind of, like, address people's needs.
Yeah. So maybe I hope this makes you happy. So just for the second time, we hired somebody with a service design background. They study service design and they now are working at our agency. So probably that says something of my attitude towards service design and the importance. I think
you made a great choice. You made a great choice.
So because in Switzerland there is a somewhere up in the mountains, of Switzerland, there is a university that actually has a curriculum service design and innovation, I think it's called, and then so I think it's getting more and more established. So
look, it's a good point. Like, so, like, in the intro you mentioned the National College of Art and Design here in Ireland, and, like, we're lucky enough now to, like, be a few years into, like, their postgrad course, which is, like, targeted at service design, and it's, like, kind of, like, it's turning out, like, newly minted, really, really skilled, really smart people every year. So I think, again, like, we're seeing it on the pull side, like, the demand is there and the supply is ramping up as well. It's, like, massively positive.
Very good. All right, I have one last question. If nobody else has, if you want to jump in. So you mentioned a couple of times these bad services and so on. Of course, you as a service designer, which service is the one that you would really love to redesign?
Oh God! And it changes, like, because, like, you kind of, you say you can't remember pain, but like, but you really do, right? So, and, and, like, once you've got that set of lenses on, you're looking around you, like, I know I had to go to A&E at one stage, right? And, like, the things that were really kind of freaking me out, in terms of, like, kind of the availability of information about my, like, my condition, like, what was going to happen next, like, and it was, like, you're very much the kind of, like, the thing within the machine, right? You weren't actually being treated as, like, someone who was, like, really, really worried about what the hell was going on and why they were feeling so weird. So, like, that's one example. I know, like, there's lots of service design, like, being done in terms of healthcare and, like, emergency healthcare. So, that's just my experience. But, like, it's kind of everything from, like, travel, so,
That's true.
Making your way through, like, an airport, like,
airports. Oh my God.
Yeah. I, like, I have to say, like, the all-time favorite was my internet service provider. Like, I won't bore you with the stories, but, like, it just, like, no. So I think there's some lessons in empathy there for some of the service providers too. They just don't understand the, like, the level of anguish and anxiety that they put people through sometimes. So.
I have a question about that. So being in the space, do you find that you're more understanding of bad service, or that you're less understanding?
That's a super good question. And I have to say that I have to just basically like hide my natural reaction sometimes, like, you know, because like, you know, if you're like, you know, waiting for so long to like, you know, speak to a person, they eventually get through and they say, well, like, you know, no, can't help you, I'm gonna, you know, pass you on. Of course, like, you know, we're all human, I'm gonna go, but you know, like I am like, you know, the inquisitive nature within me was kind of, well, there's probably a good reason for this, like, you know, so, or there's probably a reason, not maybe a good reason, but there's probably a reason for this, and perhaps this person is only like, you know, kind of able to like, you know, do these things. So like it does kind of temper your like, you know, temper your mood a little bit, but yeah, super good question, you know.
You're nicer than I am. I'm definitely less tolerant of bad products and stuff. It's like, how can you not fix this? How can you not fix it?
All right. So, Tim, do you have any kind of last things? Well, the last things you want to say. That sounds awful. But like,
any last words? Any
last words? Like, I was just gonna
tell my family I love them.
like, if people want to know more either about you, or do you want to point them somewhere where they should go in terms of service design, in terms of getting in touch with you, so something like that? I'm not.
Yeah. Look, if folks want to reach on out, you can find me on LinkedIn and hit me up, and I'm only too glad to talk about any of this stuff and more. If they want to find out more about service design in general, like, you know, apart from the handy book list and list of links, like
they will certainly gonna put in the description.
They're imminently available on this. Yeah, like I would say, check out, like, you know, kind of like, you know, design meetups, service design meetups, like, you know, in your area. So there's like, you know, there's going to be something if you're living in a kind of if you're living in a kind of an urban area, there's like, you know, there's bound to be something nearby. Yeah. Check out some conferences, see if you can kind of like, you know, figure out, is this something that like, you know, would like, you know, interest you, right? So and yeah, like, you know, apart from that, like, you know, the service design network is there, of course, like, you know, and people can kind of check it on out, but, you know, do a bit of reading, you know, reach out to the people that you've read their stuff, right? I said, like, you know, the service design community, you know, and in my experience over the last number of years, it's just been like really, really welcoming, really, really accommodating, and people are only too happy to kind of, you know, talk about stuff that interests them. So yeah, that's what I would say.
All right, perfect. So thank you so much, Tim, for doing this. And that concludes today's Product Quest podcast with Tim MacArthur. Tim, again, thank you so much for joining us.
No,
and
pleasure.
Yeah. So please send any comments or ideas for guests or topic ideas to productquestpodcast@gmail.com, and see you next time.
A squirrel.
Right? Was it a squirrel? I've thought of this.
I thought it was, yeah. So it's a very sophisticated AI background.
Yeah.